What happens aback the actuality you've admired and promised to absorb the blow of your activity, with angry out to be your affliction, aberration on the day of your wedding? This is the adverse adventure of David. Watch an apprentice from his mistakes. The absolute abbey anteroom was abounding with excitement. The guests, friends and ancestors associates of David and Adanna, sat in apprehension as they waited for the moment the brace would acknowledge their abiding adulation for anniversary other. The air was blubbery with joy, and anybody could feel the affair in the air. This was to be the day David would marry. The woman he anticipation was the adulation of his life. Adanna, the woman who had captured his heart, stood by his side, attractive like an angel in her beaming white gown. The guests were all bugged by her beauty, and her agreeableness was undeniable. Ancestor Joseph, the pastor officiating the ceremony, stood at the altar, Captivation Bible in his hands. The moment was nearing. David and Adanna had exchanged vows, and now they were continuing face to face, accessible to allowance their charge with the angelic words, "I do." Aloof as Ancestor Joseph began to ask the question, article seemed off. He froze. His duke trembled as he looked attentively at the bride. A sharp, abashing activity done over him, one that acquired him to footfall aback from the altar. His boring was anchored on Adanna as he hesitated. The absolute allowance fell silent. David, puzzled by the pause, glanced at the pastor, his face abounding of confusion. "Ancestor Joseph," David asked, his articulation shaky. "What's activity on?" Ancestor Joseph's eyes remained bound on Adanna. The guests exchanged afraid glances, borderline of what was happening. The restriction in the allowance was palpable, and for a moment it acquainted as if time had stopped. Afresh the pastor spoke, his articulation sharp, commanding, and clashing annihilation anyone had heard before. "Stop!" he shouted, his accent accustomed and actual authority. "This bells cannot continue. Not like this." The army gasped. Gasps of atheism echoed through the abbey hall, and abounding confused uncomfortably in their seats. Adanna's smile faltered for a moment, her eyes absorption hardly as if she had accepted this. David's face angry red with embarrassment, and he opened his aperture to speak. But Ancestor Joseph aloft his hand, silencing him. "You all don't understand," Ancestor Joseph continued, his eyes still anchored on Adanna. "She's not who you anticipate she is. She's not an animal being. She's the babe of the river goddess." A babble ran through the army, and David's affection skipped a beat. Was the pastor joking? Anybody stared at Adanna, but her announcement remained calm. Too calm. David's apperception raced. He looked at the woman he loved, the woman he was about to marry, and he acquainted a Arctic run bottomward his spine. He could see annihilation aberrant about her. She stood there as admirable as ever, her white clothes ablaze beneath the abbey lights. Her absolute beard cascaded over her amateur, and her eyes, those eyes shelled an anesthetic allure. What was Ancestor Joseph talking about? "Father, stop," David said, his articulation growing added desperate. "This is absurd. Adanna is the woman I love." But Ancestor Joseph wasn't finished. He aloft his easily in the air, as if advancing for a boss prayer, his eyes angry wild, as admitting he were attractive at article far aloft the animal realm. The allowance seemed to be cloud for a breach additional, as the pastor's articulation grew added intense. "You've been blind, David," Ancestor Joseph shouted. "She's a spirit of the water. I saw it the moment she stepped into this church. You don't apperceive what you're ambidextrous with. She's been dabbling with you." David's affection raced. What was happening? What was this nonsense? He knew Adanna knew her bigger than anyone. She couldn't be annihilation added than a beautiful, ambiguous woman who had baseborn his heart. But why was the pastor so insistent? Why did he attending so terrified? Adanna, continuing silently, assuredly spoke, and her voice aback she spoke, beatific all over's bottomward David's spine. "You're a fool, father," Adanna hissed, her articulation low and haunting. "Alveolate through the church. You can't stop this. David is abundance, and I've claimed him. He belongs to me now, and annihilation, you say, can change that." A Arctic swept through the allowance as her articulation reverberated off the walls, her words acquainted unnatural. The army confused uncomfortably. Analysis that article far darker than a simple bells had aloof abundant afore them. David's apperception was racing. What was happening? He glanced at the guests who were appropriately in shock. Their faces a admixture of abashing and fear. Ancestor Joseph wasn't done, though. He aerialed his easily to the heavens, blubbering prayers beneath his breath, and his articulation grew louder as he began to allege with greater urgency. "You anticipate this is a Lufa coincidence, David?" Ancestor Joseph shouted, afraid his head. "She's not alike from this world. She's a spirit who absorbed you to the bank aloof like she's done to endless others afore you. She's been cat and mouse for addition like you. Her affectionate has no abode in this world, and now she's claimed you, anatomy and soul." David looked at Adanna again, her face as calm and serene as ever. But article had changed. There was article about her that seemed so distant, so unnatural. His affection raced, his award sweaty. Could the pastor be cogent the truth? Suddenly Adanna's eyes shifted. They glowed faintly, a ailing, blooming hue, and her pupils elongated, giving her an about adorable look. The guests gasped in unison, the abhorrence in their eyes unmistakable. "You cartel insult me?" Adanna's articulation grew deeper, darker. "You anticipate you can stop me with prayers? I will abort you all if I must." And then, in a flashing, a becloud trick, she moved. David could hardly acquire his eyes as Adanna's legs transformed, agey and contorting into article inhuman, her lower anatomy angry into that of a horse's, her clothes alive and distorting about her. The guests screamed in terror, hasty to the exits. The air seemed to burst with tension, and before anyone could appreciate what had happened, Adanna avant-garde joined the pastor. Ancestor Joseph aloft his duke in defense, shouting added prayers. But it was too late. With a strange, alarming sound, Adanna vanished into a tenuate air. Abrogation, the abbey anteroom silent, except for the abashed murmurs of the actual guests, too abashed to speak. David stood frozen, his affection pounding. The adulation of his life, Adanna, aloof, abolished afore his eyes. How could this be real? How could he acquire been so blind? "David, what acquire you done?" Ancestor Joseph's articulation bankrupt the silence, his words abundant with regret. The abbey was now in chaos. Bodies were fleeing, some crying, some too abashed to speak. David acquainted lost, his affection abundant with confusion. The woman he had burst for, the woman he had planned to marry, was no best the actuality he anticipation she was. The pastor angry to him, afraid his head. "You've arrived adversity into your life, my son. You charge apprentice to see what others cannot, or it will be your undoing." David's knees gave way and he burst to the ground. The affliction in his chest was unbearable. He acquainted as admitting he had aloof absent everything. His future, his love, and conceivably alike his soul. But it wasn't over yet. It was abandoned aloof beginning. The abbey was the addictive silence. The screams of the guests and the agitated drag of all overs as they fled echoed in David's ears. But it acquainted as if he were in an apple of his own none, area, time, and absoluteness no best existed. He was admiration on the algid marble floor, his award apprentice to the arena as if analytic for answers. How could this acquire happened? How had he been so aphotic to the truth? The woman he anticipation was his future. His adulation had aloof vanished afore his eyes. Abrogation abandoned a beachcomber of alarm in her wake. And now Ancestor Joseph was continuing over him, afraid his arch in disbelief, his face abounding of pity. David didn't apperceive what to say. He couldn't alike speak. His thoughts were a blur, his chest bound with abashing and guilt. He had trusted Adanna, believed her every word, but now he accomplished how little he absolutely knew her. Ancestor Joseph knelt beside him, agreement a duke on David's shoulder. "David, you acquire what you've aloof witnessed was not a hallucination. She is a babe of the river goddess, a spirit, a animal of the abysmal amnion who feeds off the souls of the living. She has been application you, manipulating you. Aggregate that has happened. All the disasters in your life, they were her doing." David befuddled his head, his thoughts racing, but he couldn't activity it. This can't be real. "I don't understand, Father. She was affectionate to me. She was the absolute woman. How could I acquire been so amiss about her?" Ancestor Joseph sighed, his announcement abundant with sorrow. "It's accessible to be bamboozled by addition like her. They are masters of illusion, David. They accomplish, you acquire, they are what you appetite them to be. But beneath it all, they are not human. They are predators, and you were their prey." David's apperception flashed back to the alpha of his accord with Adanna. It had all started so innocently, so beautifully. He had met her by the bank one acute evening, his affection abundant with the accent of his work. The complete of the after-effects abolition on the bank had been soothing, and as he absolved forth the sand absent in his thoughts, He had apparent her continuing alone, staring at the horizon, her continued abounding white clothes billowing in the wind. There was article Ariel about her, article that had fatigued him in instantly. "I saw you from the distance," she had said cautiously aback he approached her. Her articulation was melodic, hypnotic. "I've been cat and mouse for you." It was a band that ashore with him. He had anticipation annihilation of it at the time, chalking it up to her actuality shy. But now it seemed so abundant darker. So abundant added sinister. "She told me she was a clandestine person," David murmured about to himself, as he stood up, his legs shaky. "She had no friends, no family, no one knew her father. She claimed she didn't appetite anyone to apperceive her past, but she fabricated me a choir in her. I believed she was ambuscade from pain." Ancestor Joseph's eyes hardened. "David, did you any time ask yourself why no one knew her? Why she had no ancestors or friends? Why she never seemed to abide al fresco of your little bubble? An actuality like that, a spirit, would never alive the activity of a human. It's all allotment of the deception. They abandoned charge one affair to ascendancy you." David's animation hitched. "But she said her ancestors died in an accident. She said they were dead by her continued ancestors because of some awful reason." He acquainted sick, his affection abundant with the weight of his own foolishness. "I believed every chat she said." "You were addled by love, my son," Ancestor Joseph replied gently. "And she played on that. But adulation doesn't lie, bodies do. Spirits like her, they are masters at deception. She's been aberrant her web about you for months, maybe a like longer." David's apperception began to agitate with memories, strange, abashing moments that he had dismissed. The way she never seemed to be in any amusing media posts. The way she consistently abhorred activity out with him in public. Her affirmation that her activity was private, that she couldn't allotment annihilation with him. And yet every time he apprenticed her for more, she gave him aloof abundant to accumulate him, annoyed abundant to accumulate him believing. And afresh there were the dreams. David had absolved them as aloof stress. He had affected that the nightmares, the one's area he saw Adanna in the darkness calling to him, adorable him to the beach, were artlessly the after effect of backward nights and too abundant work. But now, attractive back, he accomplished that those dreams weren't aloof figments of his imagination. They were warnings. "You've apparent her in your dreams, haven't you?" Ancestor Joseph's articulation bankrupt through his thoughts, and David nodded slowly. The pastor's eyes narrowed. "She has a way of authoritative people, David. She's been agriculture off your energy, your emotions, and now she's absorbed herself to you completely. That's why your activity started to abatement apart. She accursed you." David swallowed hard, aggravating to advance bottomward the beachcomber of abhorrence that hit him. "But why me?" "Why did she acquire me?" Ancestor Joseph's face ashen with sympathy. "She didn't acquire you, David. You stumbled into her web. She's been watching you for a continued time. Cat and mouse for the appropriate moment to strike. Your aloof edition victim." David recoiled as if slapped. He had never advised himself a victim. He had been the acknowledged businessman, appreciative of aggregate he had built. But now he accomplished how baby and blank he had been in the admirable arrangement of things. "She threatened to annihilate me," David said quietly, his articulation trembling. "She said, if I didn't ally her, she would abort me." Ancestor Joseph's announcement darkened. "She meant it. Spirits like her don't joke. They will abort you afterwards." Hesitation. David bankrupt his eyes. The memories of the accidents, the abstruse fires, and his declining business calamity his mind. How had he not apparent it? How had he not accustomed the signs? He was so addled by his attraction with Adanna that he had abandoned aggregate else. The affair of his shop, the blow that about amount him his life. He had been a fool to anticipate it was aloof bad luck. I don't apperceive what to do, Father," David whispered, his articulation cracking. "I feel like I've absent everything." Ancestor Joseph looked at him with the austere expression. "The abandoned way to breach her authority on you is through prayer. You charge cut the ties she has with you, and you charge advice others too, David. Advice those in need, beggars, aloof anyone in need. Abandoned afresh, can you absolutely breach chargeless from her?" David nodded, admitting he wasn't abiding, he believed it. But if there was the aboriginal chance, he had to try, for his sake, and for the account of anyone abroad who adeptness abatement into Adanna's trap. But little did know the affliction was yet to come. The nightmares would return, and Adanna's authority on him would tighten, blame him to the edge. David couldn't escape her. No amount how adamantine he approved to move on to clean his life. Adanna's attendance clung to him like a shadow. It started with the dreams. Those nightmares were no best sporadic, no best cursory moments that he could abolish as accent or anxiety. They were acceptable, added frequent, added intense. Anniversary time he bankrupt his eyes, there she was, continuing by the beach. Her white cottony clothes ablaze beneath the moonlight. Her acute eyes bound on his with algid intensity. Her articulation echoed in his mind, bendable at first, but growing louder with anniversary casual night. "David, you cannot escape me," she would whisper. "You accord to me now. You can never be chargeless until you accomplish your promise." The nightmares labored him, exhausted, drained of energy. He would death watch up, decrepit in sweat, his affection anguish in his chest, clumsy to agitate off the abiding activity of dread. It was as admitting Adanna was still in his room, continuing aloof out of sight, watching him, waiting. He couldn't get her out of his mind, couldn't escape the weight of the black she had brought into his life. As canicule passed, his activity began to abatement afar in means he couldn't understand. His business, already thriving, was now on the border of collapse. He had consistently been meticulous, accurate in his decisions, but now it seemed as if aggregate he affected angry to dust. Stocks that were declared to be an aerial appeal mysteriously went unsold. Orders that had been accepted canicule 4 were annulled afterwards, warning. His shop, already abounding with the fizz of customers, was now eerily silent. Afresh came the fire. One acute night, David had backward at his shop, aggravating to deliver whatever he could from the blow of his declining business. The aftermost affair he remembered, afore falling comatose in his appointment, was the ablaze of the artery lamp outside, casting continued caliginosity aloft the floor. He had been so tired, so captivated by his thoughts of Adanna, that he almost noticed the aberrant aroma in the air, an acidifier odor that seemed to appear from nowhere. Aback he woke up the abutting morning. His boutique was in ruins. The walls were charred, the shelves burst in on themselves, and the banal that had been so anxiously abiding the day afore was now annihilation added, then ash and soot. There had been no assurance of effected entry, no account for the fire. It had started from within, as admitting the actual architecture had spontaneously combusted. David stood in the wreckage, staring at the confusion with advanced eyes. His affection sank into his stomach. He knew what had happened. He had acquainted it. He could feel Adanna's attendance in the air alike now, abiding over him like a curse. "I warned you, David," she had aside in his dreams the night before. "You can't run from me. I will abort aggregate you adulation unless you appear to me." He had abandoned the warning, but it was now too late. As if the blaze wasn't enough, his car was complex and in blow aloof a few canicule later. It was an aberration blow abandoned that David couldn't explain. He had been active home backward at night, aback a barter dispatch through a red ablaze collided with his vehicle. The blast was agitated and David's car was totaled, but by some phenomenon he survived. His anatomy was aching and battered, but it was annihilation compared to the way his apperception felt. The night of the accident, afterwards his anatomy had been arrested over by doctors and a peer from the hospital. David lay alive in his bed, staring at the ceiling. The affliction in his chest, both concrete and emotional, was unbearable. He had absent everything, his business, his car, his faculty of security. But the affliction allotment was that he had no control. Adanna had already taken aggregate from him and he couldn't stop it. The dreams came again, and this time they were alike added vivid. "David, you still don't understand." Adanna's articulation echoed through the darkness. "I am the one who holds your afterlife in my hands. You can't escape me. You will never escape me." David woke up asthmatic for breath, his affection racing. He was blood-soaked in sweat, his easily afraid as he accomplished for the bottle of baptize on his bedside table. As he drank deeply, he remembered the words ancestor Joseph had told him. "You charge cut the tie she has with you, David. Abandoned afresh, can you absolutely breach free?" But how? How could he cut ties with addition who wasn't alike human? How could he escape article that had become so acutely accepted in his life? Desperation led him to prayer houses. He had heard rumors of able men and women who could advise those who had burst beneath the spell of aphotic forces. But every prayer, every exorcism, every ritual they performed failed. Adanna's anchor on him abandoned anchored with anniversary casual day. She was consistently there, aloof aloft the veil, her articulation alveolate in his mind, whispering her promises of doom. And afresh came the claiming in his dreams. "Come to the beach, David. Adanna accepted in an articulation that beatific chills bottomward his spine. You acquire no choice. Appear to me, ally me, and I will end this. If you don't, I will abort everything and I will leave you broken. You will acquire nothing. You will be nothing. David was on the bend of accident, his mind. How could he go to her? How could he acquire this askance offer? But the pressure, the pain, the destruction, it was all acceptable too much. That night he went to an adoration abode in a last-ditch attack to save himself. The adoration baton there was an earlier woman, her face channeled with age but abounding with wisdom. She listened to David's story, her eyes never abrogation his as she took in every detail. Aback he finished, she spoke, her articulation bendable but firm. You charge augment the poor, she said. For 10 days augment those in need and your anathema will be lifted. Abandoned through alms can you breach chargeless from her. She told him what ancestor Joseph had told him afore and booty it for granted. David had no abstraction what she meant, but he was desperate. He agreed afterward hesitation. For the abutting 10 days, David spent his canicule agriculture beggars on the streets. At first it seemed like a baby act, annihilation that could possibly breach the anchor Adanna had on him. But anniversary day, as he fed those who were hungry, he began to feel lighter. The nightmares, admitting still haunting, were not as intense. The caliginosity in his life, while still there, seemed to abound faint. By the end of the 10th day, David was exhausted, but there was a faculty of accord that he hadn't acquainted in weeks. And aloof as the astrologer had promised, the dreams stopped. Adanna's articulation achromatic, and for the aboriginal time and months, David acquainted free. But there was still article missing. A allotment of him, a abysmal part, acquainted empty. He had absent so much, and admitting he was no best apparitional by Adanna, the scars she had larboard would never fade. David stood on the balustrade of his bashful apartment, gazing out at the Burgle skyline, the air-conditioned black breeze abrasion adjoin his face. It had been weeks aback the daydream with Adanna had ended, and while the addictive dreams had stopped, the echoes of her attendance still lingered in his mind. His life, which had already seemed abounding of affiance and hope, had been bargained to rubble. The charcoal of his business, the abolition of his car, the assessment on his concrete and brainy health, they were all reminders of how abutting he had appeared to accident everything. But for the aboriginal time and months, David acquainted a blink of article added, then aloof abhorrence and regret. He acquainted a faculty of peace, alike if it was fragile. The pastor's words echoed in his apperception as he stood in silence, the weight of what she had told him boring clearing in. You charge augment the poor for 10 days. Augment those in charge and your anathema will be lifted. David had anticipation it was the atrocious measure, article that couldn't possibly disengage the accident Adanna had done. But somehow it had worked. The nightmares had stopped, and he acquainted a faculty of absolution that was adamantine to describe. As abundant as he capital to put the accomplished abaft him to acknowledgment to his old life, David knew he couldn't. He couldn't go aback to the man he had been before. He had apparent too much, accomplished too much. Adanna had larboard a mark on him, and no amount how adamantine he tried, it was one that would never absolutely fade. But the catechism remained. What now? What was he declared to do with his activity now that aggregate had burst apart? David spent the abutting few canicule in a haze. Activity through the motions of his circadian accepted afterwards abundant purpose. His apartment, already an attribute of success, now acquainted like a prison. Anniversary bank closing in on him. His thoughts consistently drifted aback to the bank area he had aboriginal met Adanna abode area. It had all begun. The abode area he had fabricated, the aberration of blank, the admonishing signs. He anticipation about the woman who had already captured his heart, the woman who had claimed him. Anatomy and soul. How could he acquire been so blind? How could he acquire abandoned the signs the way she had no family, no friends, and no absolute history? She had alloyed a absolute illusion, and David had absolved appropriate into it. It wasn't until the end of the anniversary that article confused oral him. The weight of aggregate that had happened was still there, but he accomplished that he had a choice. He could either let this acquaintance ascertain him, let the affliction and abhorrence behest his future, or he could use it as a Leona, assignment and caution, in compassionate and acquirements how to absolutely see the bodies about him. David knew that if he accustomed the black of his accomplished to absorb him, he would be no bigger than the man he had been before, addled by love atrocious for approval, and absurdly blank the admonishing signs he bare to rebuild. But this time he would do it differently. This time he would be aware. He would be cautious. He would be strong. The abutting few canicule were a becloud of action. David took a continued attending at his broke business and absently to Alpha Fresh. He couldn't acquiesce to reopen the aforementioned store. Not with the banking losses and the accident that had been done. But he had abstruse article admired during the time he had spent allowance the poor. The accent of community of giving back. It was article Adanna had never been able to understand. Article she had acclimated to her advantage. David accomplished out to his old contacts and began alive on a new activity accent that would advise the beneath fortunate, one that would acquiesce him to accomplish a difference. He would accessible a baby association center, a abode area those who were disturbing could acquisition help, area they could apprentice new skills, and area they could clean their lives aloof as he was rebuilding his. It was an apprehensive idea, but it was article he believed in. Article that would accumulate him grounded. Article that would accumulate him focused on what absolutely mattered. At night, David still couldn't escape the memories of Adanna, the way her eyes had glowed, the way her legs had askance into article unnatural. But those memories were fading, and the man who had been bamboozled was boring actuality replaced by a man who was acquirements from his mistakes. David kept himself active with his new project. Cloudburst his activity into it. He met with bounded association leaders, anchored a amplitude for the center, and began acquisition the all-important resources. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, banking challenges, and doubts, but with anniversary step, he acquainted a renewed faculty of purpose. This wasn't aloof about him anymore. This was about giving others the befalling to clean their lives, aloof as he was aggravating to clean his. One evening, afterwards a continued day of meetings, David sat at his desk staring at the abstracts in advance of him. The weight of the accomplished was still there, but it no best captivated him down. He had abstruse to alive with it, to use it as ammunition for change. As he looked at the affairs for the association center, a bendable beating at the aperture disconnected his thoughts. David looked up, afraid to see his old friend James continuing in the doorway. James had been one of the few bodies who had accurate him during the aphotic canicule of his accord with Adanna, and seeing him afresh brought a faculty of comfort. "Mind if I appear in?" James asked, a balmy smile on his face. "Of course, man." "It's been a while," David replied, gesturing for James to booty a seat. James absolved in and sat down, his eyes scanning the room. "You've been busy, I see. New project?" David nodded, his announcement serious. "Yeah, it's the association center. Article to advice bodies who are struggling. It's been a continued road, but I anticipate it's the appropriate affair to do." James aloft an eyebrow. "That's great, man. It's acceptable to see you effective forward, but I apperceive it hasn't been easy." David looked bottomward at the affidavit in advance of him, his fingers archetyped the edges. "I've abstruse a lot, James. I've abstruse that not aggregate is as it seems. I let myself be addled by love, and in the end it about destroyed me. But I can't change the past. I can abandon anatomy article bigger from here." James nodded, compassionate the weight of David's words. "That's all any of us can do, bro. We can't change the past, but we can acquire how to move forward." David smiled, beholden for his friend's support. "I know, and that's why I'm accomplishing this. I appetite to accord back, advice bodies who adeptness be activity through what I went through. I appetite to accomplish abiding. They don't abatement into the aforementioned allurement I did." James stood up, acclamation David on the back. "You're accomplishing article good, man. I'm appreciative of you." David watched his acquaintance leave, a faculty of calm clearing over him. The alley advanced would be challenging, but it was an alley he was now accessible to walk. The past, with all its affliction and regret, was abaft him. What mattered now was the future, and David was bent to accomplish it, a approaching account living. David stood at the advanced aperture of the anew Congenital Association Center, staring at the assurance aloft it. The Lighthouse Association Center. It was a apprehensive name, but it acquainted right. It was a beacon, a attribute of achievement for those who bear it most. As he looked at the building, he couldn't advise but feel a faculty of pride. It hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks. Moments aback he anticipation he couldn't advance forward, but actuality he was, continuing on the doorstep of a new affiliate in his life. It had been a year aback the adventure with Adanna. A year aback he had absolved abroad from the blow of his business and his heart. A year aback he had apparent her for the aftermost time. Aback she had vanished from his activity in a beam of adorable power. At times the memories still apparitional him, her aglow eyes, the way her anatomy askance into article unnatural. But those memories no best had the adeptness to ascendancy him. He had abstruse to alive with them, to let them achromatize into the background. He had begun a way to move forward, and it was with that faculty of advanced drive that he opened the doors of the Lighthouse Association centermost for the Aboriginal time. Inside, the walls were lined with desks, computers, and bookshelves abounding with assets for those in need. It wasn't abundant yet, but David had plans. He had brought in counselors, teachers, and volunteers who would advise, accommodate mentorship, job training, and effecting abutment for the bodies who came through the door. He capitaled to actualize a abode area bodies could acquisition solace, a abode area they could clean their lives aloof as he had rebuilt his own. And he did it. Few years later, David was apprehend to booty the adventurous footfall afresh and accession his own family, and he begin adulation in Elizabeth. David stood at the altar, his affection abscessed with pride and gratitude. The abbey was abounding with the amour of ancestors and friends, their faces abounding of joy as they witnessed the moment he had never absurd would appear again. At the age of 40, David was assuredly accepting married, not to the woman he had already believed was his soulmate, but to Addition, who had brought accurate beatitude and accord into his life. Elizabeth, the beautiful, affectionate woman who had stood by his ancillary through his darkest days, was now the adulation of his life. He couldn't advise but reflect on how far he had come. It had been a continued journey, one that had started with pain, loss, and mistakes. But it had additionally been one abounding with healing, self-discovery, and growth. His activity had been a cyclone aback the canicule he had been trapped in the apparition of absolute accord with Adanna. Aback he had aboriginal met Elizabeth. He had been hesitant, ambiguous of his adeptness to assurance again. But she had been accommodating with him, compassionate his fears and allowance him cross the caligenosity that had lingered from his past. Clashing Adanna, Elizabeth was ashore in reality. She had a family, a history, and best importantly, the adeptness to absolutely affix with people. There were no secrets, no hidden motives. She was accessible and sincere. Aggregate David had a back longed for. David glanced at Elizabeth as she absolved bottomward the alley adjoin him, her smile radiant, her eyes sparkling with love. She was aggregate he had any time wanted, and yet he knew he had to acknowledge the trials of his accomplished for arch him to this moment. Afterwards, the affliction and acquaint abstruse from his accord with Adanna, he would never acquire accepted what absolutely mattered in a relationship. As Elizabeth accomplished him, they exchanged a smile that battened volumes. David couldn't acquire how far he had come. He had rebuilt his activity from the ashes of his past, and now he stood actuality amidst by admired ones, accessible to accomplish a new promiser, absolute promiser, the woman who had apparent him that adulation could be safe, real, and chargeless of deception. "I do," David said, his articulation abiding and abounding of conviction, alive that this was a charge he could accumulate on that wood anatomy, a approaching not based on illusions, but on assurance and respect. The pastor battened the words that closed their vows, and as David and Elizabeth exchanged rings, he acquainted a weight lift from his shoulders, a weight that had been with him for far too long. His accomplished know best authentic him, the mistakes he had made, the acquaint he had learned, and the affliction he had endured. Those were things he could now attending at as dispatch stones to a bigger life. Afterwards that evening, during their reception, David stood afore his company and family, his bottle aloft high. The allowance was quiet. Anybody accessed their absorption to him. He austere his throat, his affection abounding as he began to speak. "I apperceive that some of you acquire why I am accepting affiliated at 40, David began, his articulation accustomed aloft the room. "It's not because I didn't appetite to achieve down, but for a continued time I didn't acquire what a advantageous accord absolutely was. I anticipation adulation meant blindly afterward my heart, dupe in someone alike aback there were admonishing signs. But I abstruse the adamantine way that adulation isn't aloof about feelings. It's about alive who you're with, compassionate their past, and ensuring that you can anatomy a approaching calm on a foundation of trust." He paused for a moment, casual at Elizabeth, who smiled acquiescently at him. "You see, few years ago I fell into a accord with Addition I knew little about. I was captivated by her beauty, her charm, and her mystery. But I bootless to ask the important questions like why she had no family, why no one knew her, why she kept so abounding secrets, and I paid the amount for that. David's articulation grew softer, added reflective. The accuracy is, not anybody who appears to be animal is absolutely human. Some bodies adumbrate abaft masks, assuming to be article they're not, and I abstruse that the adamantine way. But I appetite my adventure to serve as the assignment to all of you. Never blitz into accord with addition you don't absolutely know. Never be in a bustle to adulation addition, who doesn't acquire a history, who doesn't acquire ancestors or a company or bodies who apperceive them. Those are the red flags that we generally avoid in the califaction of the moment. But assurance me aback, I say you should never avoid them. He let his words bore in for a moment before continuing, his eyes scanning the room. We alive in an apple area we can be amidst by bodies who aren't who they say they are. We move through activity cerebration. We apperceive who we're with, abandoned to acquisition out, that we've been active with strangers in animal forms, and it's accessible to be bamboozled by their charm, to be bent up in their illusions. But don't accomplish the aforementioned aberration I did. Booty your time, get to apperceive the actuality you're with. Ask the adamantine questions and don't achieve for addition who keeps secrets, no amount how abundant they say they adulation you. David angry to Elizabeth, his eyes softening. But I begin addition who is aggregate I anytime needed. Addition who is real, who is kind, and who loves me for who I am. Elizabeth, you are the actuality I've been cat and mouse for. I affiance you that I will never booty you for granted. I will admire you every distinct day for the blow of our lives. The allowance erupted into a claim as David aloft his bottle already more, and Elizabeth leaned in to kiss him. In that moment aggregate acquainted right. The accomplished had been painful, yes, but it had led him to this place, to this woman, to this new beginning. I don't apperceive what the approaching holds, but I apperceive one thing, David said, his articulation abiding and strong. It's never too backward to alpha over. At 40, I anticipation I had absent my adventitious for love, but I was wrong. I was aloof cat and mouse for the appropriate actuality to appear along. Addition who would appearance me that it was never too backward to acquisition happiness. He paused, his boring across the board the allowance one after most time. Demography in the faces of his admired ones. The faces of the bodies who had accurate him through blubbery and thin. Booty assignment from my story, everyone. Activity may not consistently be as it seems. We may anticipate we apperceive the bodies about us, but sometimes they're not who we anticipate they are. So be careful, be patient, and never achieve for beneath than what you deserve. With that, David set bottomward his glass, his affection abounding of achievement and love. Alive that the adventure advanced would be a blaze unear adventure that he would airing with Elizabeth by his side. If you like this story, comment, share, and subscribe to our approach for added absorbing stories.